The House Behind the Mists. A stone mansion lost in the mists, defying time. Located on one of the gloomy coasts of northern Europe, this structure, built in the early 1940s, was for a long time merely a dot on regional maps. In the most difficult days of the post-war period, people were even hesitant to approach this somber house. The reason was perhaps the devastation wrought by the war, or perhaps the rumors spread by word of mouth. Among the villagers, it was said that the walls of that house were made not of ordinary stones, but of a curse kneaded with fear, mourning, and loss. The house stood on a slope near the sea, shrouded in mist for most of the year. Hence, the locals had named it the House of Mists. A place where shadows grew heavier despite the daylight, where even the wind turned into a groaning murmur. Which architect built it, and for whom was never confirmed. The archives only contained records of mysterious accidents experienced by the workers shortly after construction began. Some had fallen down the stairs, others had disappeared for no reason. But all this had been overlooked in the chaotic atmosphere of the war. In 1946, immediately after the end of the war, the new owners of the house appeared. A woman. She moved into this mansion with her 2 small children. It was said her husband had not returned from the front, and his fate was unknown. The woman had stated that she had taken refuge here to protect her children from the evils of the outside world. We find her name in official records as Elizabeth Hargrove. According to some sources, she came from a noble family. According to others, her past was entirely shrouded in mist. The period when Elizabeth moved was a time when Europe's wounds had not yet healed. People were busy commemorating their lost loved ones. Churches were overflowing, and tears were never absent from the cemeteries. And it was in these very days that the Hargrove family settled into this almost abandoned, grandiose house. The mansion, which at first glance seemed like a safe, quiet shelter, soon began to attract the attention of the townspeople once again. Most of the villagers described Elizabeth as well-intentioned but strange. The children never came out into the sunlight, and even when playing in the garden, the curtains were always kept closed. Although she claimed there was a medical explanation for this situation, the whispers only spread. The house still harbors the spirits of its former owners. The few photographs from those years, old newspaper clippings, and neighbors' statements show that this house was not an ordinary living space from the very first day. It is said that the lamps burning inside the house at night appeared in different rooms when viewed through the mist, then suddenly vanished. Often, the children's laughter would spill outside, only to be followed by a deep silence. The villagers claimed that Elizabeth was talking not to her children, but to completely different voices. The House of Mists had already been etched in the minds of the townspeople as a dark shadow long before Elizabeth and her children moved in. When the archives are examined, it is seen that the mansion had passed through the hands of at least 3 different families. However, the striking point was that no family had stayed here for long. It is known that the first family to move into the house in the late 1800s managed to live there for only 5 years. The sudden death of the father figure, followed by a mysterious fire in their young daughter's room. The fire was extinguished before it could engulf the entire house, but no one had stayed in that room since that day. It is said that stain marks are still visible on the ceiling today. The second family, who owned the house in the early 1900s, had to abandon the mansion halfway due to financial difficulties. However, the strange signs carved into the walls of the house had become a source of gossip for the town. Some workers claimed these symbols were not religious, but remnants of occult rituals. Unfortunately, most of these signs faded over time, leaving behind only a few rusty photographs. The third family, however, could only endure a year in the house. According to neighbors' accounts, the family's young child constantly said at night that there were others in the room. The father figure had bolted awake one night at a scream from the child's room, but was seen leaving the house that night and never returned. Neither his body was found, nor any trace of him. The mother and child locked the house door and left the town just before dawn. After that day, the mansion remained empty for a long time. All these past events were a worrying sign for the townspeople on the day Elizabeth Hargrove and her children moved in. The villagers warned Elizabeth repeatedly. They told her that house was unlucky, that no one could find peace there. But Elizabeth dismissed these words as mere superstition. To her, the mansion was the only way to start over after the war. The only shelter that could keep her children away from the outside world and protect them. But the house itself began to shape their lives with a different spirit from the very first day. Elizabeth made a habit of keeping the curtains closed on the day they moved in. Although her reason was her children's sensitivity, some neighbors claimed to see shadows coming from the windows of the house at night. Although the curtains were closed, there were silhouettes reflected from inside. The corridors of the house were gloomy even in daylight. The echoing footsteps in the high-ceilinged halls, though belonging to one of the residents, often could not be located. Because of this, the servants felt nervous entering the house and never wanted to roam the rooms alone at night. Shortly after settling in, Elizabeth began looking for new servants. The previous ones couldn't even last a few weeks, quitting for various excuses. Finally, 3 people arrived at the door: an old woman, a silent young girl beside her, and a gardener leaning on his cane. They introduced themselves and saw no issue entering the house. The townspeople thought they too would soon flee the house. Unexpectedly, however, these 3 chose to stay. From this point on, the mansion began to transform from just a shelter into a labyrinth filled with shadows, whispers, and echoes of the past. The children avoided entering certain parts of the house, especially steering clear of the room at the end of the long corridor on the upper floor. And perhaps the most remarkable detail was this: the townspeople swore that Elizabeth did not live alone in the house. The shadows reflected on the windows at night resembled not just the 3 servants, but the silhouettes of many more people. Just a few weeks after Elizabeth Hargrove and her children began living in the mansion, the house's eerie atmosphere made itself felt for the first time. Events that initially seemed ordinary quickly escalated to levels that disturbed peace and made one question their sanity. The first thing noticed was the doors opening and closing by themselves. The house was built on a windy slope, so Elizabeth initially attributed this to natural causes. But in time, she realized that the doors only opened and closed in certain rooms and at certain times. Especially when the fog descended in the afternoon, the echoing door creaks along the upper corridor made everyone uneasy. The servants repeatedly stated that they had left the doors locked. But every morning, all the rooms were found wide open. The children, however, were having much stranger experiences. Elizabeth's daughter had written these lines in her diary. It is claimed they were found among records. "Last night, I was not alone in my room. There was a child watching me from between the curtains. His hair seemed gray, his hands cold. He wanted to talk to me, but I didn't want my mother to wake up. When I closed my eyes, he was gone." Were these lines just products of her children's imagination, or were there truly other entities roaming the house? In this part of the documentary, we include the testimony of one of the former servants. The children constantly said others were roaming the house. "We servants would hear heavy footsteps in the empty corridors of the upper floor in the evenings. But when we went up there, no one would be there. Once, I heard whispers behind a door. When I opened it, the room was completely empty." The initial signs were not limited to just sounds or shadows. In time, even the air in the house began to change. Some rooms were perpetually cold. Even if the fireplace was lit, a frozen wind would fill the room towards dawn. The mirrors would fog up, faint traces appearing on their surfaces. Once, the gardener, while cleaning the windows early in the morning, said he saw a face staring back at him from inside. No one in the house was awake at that hour. Elizabeth tried to find logical explanations for all these events. To calm her children, she told them there was no such thing as ghosts, describing the house's noises as the groaning of old stones. But when she heard footsteps rising from the corridors while sitting in her room at night, she could not deny the fear that gripped her. Another frightening detail was the shadows seen in certain rooms of the house. These shapes reflected on the wall in the lamplight sometimes resembled a person, sometimes defied any description. The younger servant once claimed to have gone down to the laundry room and seen the shadow of an old woman holding a candle in the corner. But she was alone there at that moment. And the most frightening, the children constantly talked about the others. The girl had asked her mother, "Will you let me play with the other children?" When Elizabeth replied in astonishment, "There are no other children here," the little girl insistently gave this response. "They are always here. Sometimes they are in my room, sometimes in the corridor. They don't want you to see us." These statements began to shake even Elizabeth's composure. The signs that not only losses but other invisible lives existed in the house were increasing. Researchers examined the topic from two different angles. The first was a psychological interpretation. War trauma, fear of loss, and the feeling of isolation in a secluded house may have led to hallucinations. The second was a paranormal interpretation. The symbols carved into the walls of the house suggest that this place has been used as a ritual area since the past. This could cause the boundaries between the dead and the living to blur. The initial signs had now reached an undeniable level. And this was only the beginning. After the first signs, the events happening inside the house could no longer be explained as mere coincidence or children's imagination. Elizabeth initially resisted as a patient and strong mother. But as days passed, she began to feel an increasingly heavy pressure both in her own mind and on the walls of the house. The townspeople could observe this silent collapse the Hargrove family was undergoing from the outside. Elizabeth was becoming increasingly withdrawn, not attending Sunday services as regularly as before. When seen with her children, her face always had a tense expression. Rumors spread. The mother might be losing her mind. But those inside the house knew the truth was much more terrifying. The old woman servant had said this to Elizabeth in the following days. "Madam, we are not alone in this house. There are shadows enduring us. They are silent but watching." Elizabeth at first vehemently denied these words. But soon she began to see with her own eyes. She said she saw a silhouette appearing at the end of the corridor one night in the dim candlelight. When she approached, the figure suddenly vanished. Then, the door slammed shut by itself. The children went even further. Elizabeth's son was drawing foreign faces in his sketchbook, telling his mother, "They live with us." The figures the children depicted matched exactly the old families who had lived in the house years ago, according to the townspeople. This detail is considered one of the most chilling pieces of evidence for today's researchers. The children couldn't possibly have known those families. Fragments of the diary belonging to the little girl of the first family who lived in the house, lines beginning with, "Someone comes to my room when night falls," drawings of the occult signs seen on the doors. Although researchers cannot definitively verify the accuracy of such documents, the striking similarities with the historical narrative were notable. The experts examining the events were also divided. Those advocating the psychiatric view said, Elizabeth and her children are typical examples of post-war trauma. Isolation, fear of loss, and the grieving process led to hallucinations, which combined with the house's ominous past to turn into ghost stories. Those advocating the paranormal researcher view said, the recurring disappearances throughout the house's history, the symbols, and the children's accounts suggest that this is one of the areas where the boundary between the living and the dead is weakest. This is not an ordinary house, it is virtually a gateway. Elizabeth's belief was gradually shaking. She said that even while praying for her children's safety, she heard another whisper behind her own voice. In the mirrors, she began to see not only her own face but faint shadows behind her. Before falling asleep at night, she swore that someone was watching her from her doorway. The servants, however, grew increasingly silent. The old woman, the young girl, and the gardener seemed to know something about the secrets of the house but were hesitant to speak. Elizabeth had noticed the strange expression in their eyes. It was as if they had come to this house not just to serve, but for a much deeper reason. Now, the House of Mists was transforming from just a fear-inducing mansion into a space where the living and the dead mingled and time bent. And the most terrifying thing was this. Elizabeth began to suspect that the strangers in the house were not just spirits. They had a more tangible, more dangerous existence. As the days progressed, Elizabeth began to feel the pressure in the house's atmosphere reaching unbearable levels. She now knew that invisible beings roamed inside not only at night but also during the day. Although the curtains were closed, shadows passing through the light, silhouettes appearing momentarily in dim rooms constantly made their presence felt. The children also began to have nightmares more frequently. Her little daughter would wake up screaming from her sleep, saying a strange woman was sitting at the foot of her bed. Her son often whispered to his mother, "They are watching us, but they are not hiding anymore." The servants could no longer maintain their silence either. The old woman went to Elizabeth quietly one night and said, "This is their house, we are guests." No matter how much Elizabeth insisted, she gave no further explanation. But the fear in her eyes told much more than her words. The gardener, meanwhile, had found small pits in the ground around the house that looked freshly dug. These marks had no logical explanation. A new one appeared every morning, disappearing by nightfall. Elizabeth's mental health was gradually unraveling. To protect her children, she began keeping all the doors locked. But every morning the locks were found open, the doors ajar. Once, her bedroom door slammed open violently at midnight. Elizabeth rushed out with her candle, but saw nothing in front of her. However, she heard the echo of a heavy, muffled breath from the end of the corridor. As the sound approached, the candle flame flickered and then went out completely. More terrifying events were happening in the children's room. One morning, the little girl was found hiding under her bed. In a trembling voice, she could only say, "That man was here all night." When Elizabeth looked under the bed, she found no one, but a cold air hit her face. Her son, meanwhile, had begun drawing not just faces but whole family portraits in his sketchbook. The drawings showed foreign children, old women, even a man with a cane. When Elizabeth noticed how much these pictures resembled the house's past owners, she froze in terror. Now, daily life in the house had lost all meaning. The children's laughter had been replaced by whispers, prayers by fear-filled silences. At night, footsteps rose from the entire house, doors slammed one after another, muffled sounds came from the walls. The most horrifying was the faces appearing in the mirrors. One day, when Elizabeth stood before the mirror, she saw two foreign faces next to her own. When she turned around, no one was in the room. When she looked back at the mirror, those faces were still there, staring at her without looking away. From that moment on, Elizabeth began to feel the house establishing an authority over her and her children. It was as if every wall, every door, every window continued to live to slowly consume them. The servants now avoided eye contact, speaking to each other only in whispers. The children said they felt the presence of strangers even next to their mother. And Elizabeth confessed perhaps her greatest fear, that the entities in the house were not just spirits from the past, that some of them might still be something living. The House of Mists was now not just a shelter, but a trap where the dead and the living mingled. And whether there was a way out of this trap, no one knew. A sinister hum rising suddenly inside the house at midnight echoed like a scream tearing from the depths of the walls. When Elizabeth jumped from her bed, she was startled by a sharp scream from her children's room. She ran and opened the door, but the sight inside took her breath away. The children were trembling in the middle of the bed, hugging each other, their eyes fixed on the emptiness in the corner of the room. No one was there, but the room's air was icy, even breathing was painful. And at that moment, an unseen force slammed all the doors shut one by one. The house was sealed like a closing coffin. Elizabeth tried to approach her children, but an invisible hand seemed to push her back. When her eyes shifted to the room's walls, she saw words appearing in blood-red letters. "We are here." The letters flashed for a moment, then quickly vanished. As the children cried, the room began to fill with a thick mist. When the mist cleared, the entities that had only been felt as shadows until then appeared for the first time in all their clarity. The silhouettes of the house's former owners, in ancient attire, were lined up inside the room, looking at Elizabeth and her children with empty, cold eyes. An old man stepped forward. His lips didn't move, but his voice echoed through the room. "This house is ours. You are merely shadows standing in the wrong time, the wrong place." Elizabeth wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She hugged her children, closed her eyes. At that moment, all the lights went out, and a hum coming from the depths of the house rose loud enough to deafen the ears. When morning came, the mansion was silent. Some of the neighboring villagers, curious about the whispers coming from the house for days, came to the door. The door was ajar. When they entered, the rooms were empty. There was no trace of Elizabeth or her children. The furniture was in place, half-eaten plates remained on the dining table, but no living soul remained inside the house. Or rather, no one alive. The villagers later whispered to each other about the only thing they found in the children's room. On the bed sat the little girl's doll. One of the doll's glass eyes was cracked. On the notebook page, there was one last drawing: Elizabeth and her two children standing in front of the house, a massive shadow enveloping them completely behind. Even years later, the townspeople lower their voices when speaking of that house. Some claim they still see silhouettes in the windows at night. Others say the voices carried by the wind mix with children's laughter. But what is truly frightening is what a few strangers who dared to see the house have told. "When we entered, we were not alone. There were footsteps in the corridors, faces appeared in the mirrors. And when we tried to leave, the doors locked behind us." This event, which went down in the pages of history, lifted the mansion from being just an abandoned stone structure. It was now remembered as a place where the line between the living and the dead had completely disappeared. Elizabeth and her children were never found again. Perhaps their existence now continues to wander among the mists, along with the house's other inhabitants. A single question arises in the mind of everyone who steps through that door. Were they the ones who truly disappeared, or are we who remain still like ghosts?